The great question. Imagine waking up one day to find that the noise of the world has grown unbearably loud. Not the physical noise of traffic, conversations, or machines, but the psychic noise that pours constantly from the expectations of society, from the endless chatter of others' opinions, from the relentless pulse of conformity pressing upon your mind like an invisible weight. You feel yourself suffocated by the demands to belong, to socialize, to seek approval from people who never truly see you. And in that moment of suffocation, a terrifying thought cuts through. What if the very thing you have been told to fear the most, solitude, is in fact the only path to truth? What if withdrawing from society is not a sign of weakness, but of the deepest strength? This paradox lies at the heart of Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy, and it unsettles everything we assume about happiness, community, and the purpose of human life. The paradox is simple, yet devastating. Society insists that the measure of a good life is found in our relationships, our social standing, our constant engagement with others. To retreat from the world, to choose silence over chatter, to embrace solitude instead of community, these acts are often branded as antisocial, eccentric, or even pathological. And yet, Schopenhauer argued that the greatest minds, the deepest thinkers, the most honest seekers of truth inevitably turn their backs on the herd. They choose solitude not out of misanthropy, but because the noise of society drowns out the signal of reality. For Schopenhauer, the rare individual who sees through illusion must walk alone. But if that is true, then we must confront a haunting question. Are we all merely distracting ourselves with shallow connections, mistaking noise for meaning? Consider how easily we chase belonging. From childhood, you were told that being popular, being surrounded by friends, being admired by others is the key to happiness. And yet, how often does the crowd betray you with its superficiality? How often do you feel lonelier in a room full of people than you do when you sit quietly by yourself? This contradiction gnaws at the human heart. We crave company, but company rarely brings us closer to truth. What we call connection is often nothing more than mutual distraction. We distract each other from the unbearable weight of existence. And so the question arises, what if solitude, the condition we most fear, is the only state where the self can truly awaken? Schopenhauer unmasks the cruel comedy of human life. He tells us that the masses live in perpetual illusion, enslaved to their desires, their envy, their shallow pleasures. They cling to society because society mirrors back their delusions, but the philosopher, the artist, the sage, they are forced into solitude because they cannot unsee what they have seen. To them, the chatter of the crowd is unbearable, and so they retreat, not to escape reality, but to face it head-on. Alone, stripped of distraction, they can confront the abyss of existence. Yet this image of the solitary genius terrifies us, because it forces us to ask, what if our friendships, our routines, even our conversations are only fragile shields against the silence that contains truth? Pause for a moment and imagine your own life. Imagine sitting in an empty room with no phone, no television, no voices to fill the silence. At first, you might feel restless, even panicked. The silence presses on you, and you sense the abyss of your own thoughts threatening to swallow you. But what if, instead of fleeing back to distraction, you leaned into that silence? What if solitude was not emptiness, but fullness, a space where the world's illusions finally dissolve? Schopenhauer would tell you that the wise do exactly this. They do not fear solitude, because they know solitude is where the veil of society falls away. But if this is true, then a terrifying conclusion follows. Perhaps most people will never encounter truth because they cannot endure being alone with it. Why does this matter? Because it forces us to confront the great question. Is society a cure for loneliness, or is it the very thing that makes us lonely? Does constant interaction with others bring us closer to ourselves, or does it only bury the self deeper under layers of performance and expectation? The paradox Schopenhauer presents is brutal. The more we immerse ourselves in society, the further we drift from authenticity. And yet the more we withdraw into solitude, the more unbearable life feels, at least at first. To walk alone is to face the full weight of existence without the crutch of distraction. Only a few souls are strong enough to endure it. But those who do find themselves awakening to truths that the crowd will never glimpse. This leaves us suspended in an unsettling dilemma. On one side, the comfort of society, noise, distraction, shallow connection, but also safety. On the other side, the starkness of solitude, silence, discomfort, even despair, but also the possibility of awakening. Which would you choose? Which can you endure? To walk with the crowd is to remain asleep. To walk alone is to risk madness. But perhaps in that risk lies the only chance at truth. And so, the great question emerges, demanding an answer you cannot escape. If solitude is the path of the wise, then why do we fear it so desperately? Why do we cling to others even when they do not truly see us? Why do we pretend that society gives us meaning when deep down we know it only shields us from silence? This is the paradox Schopenhauer places before us. And whether we like it or not, it is a mirror that reflects back the uncomfortable truth of our own existence. The hidden problem, its psychological, philosophical roots. If solitude is the hidden doorway to truth, then why does it feel like a prison to most of us? Why, when left alone with our thoughts, do we feel such unease, such dread, that we rush back to the noise of society? To answer this, we must unearth a darker reality. The human mind itself is not built for peace, but for restlessness. Arthur Schopenhauer insisted that life is driven by a blind, insatiable force he called the will, a ceaseless hunger that keeps us striving, desiring, and suffering. To sit in solitude is to strip away the distractions that conceal this will. Suddenly, we encounter the raw machinery of our own being, our cravings, our fears, our dissatisfaction. Society exists, in part, as a grand theater that distracts us from this truth. We fear solitude not because it is empty, but because it is brutally honest. Psychology affirms what Schopenhauer intuited centuries ago. Consider the phenomenon of hedonic adaptation, the tendency of humans to quickly return to a baseline level of dissatisfaction no matter what pleasures or achievements they obtain. We chase new possessions, new friendships, new social approval, but within weeks the satisfaction fades and the hunger returns. Society reinforces this cycle by offering us endless goals and comparisons, careers to climb, status to maintain, people to impress. Solitude threatens this cycle because in silence, the illusion of progress collapses. Without the validation of others, without the next social reward, you are left face to face with the futility of desire itself. No wonder the crowd flees the silence. It is not the absence of company they fear, it is the exposure of their own inner void. Carl Jung warned of this very danger when he wrote that loneliness does not come from having no people about one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important. Jung recognized that most human interactions are shallow exchanges that leave the deepest parts of the self unspoken. The individual who dares to touch the depths, the one who wrestles with questions of meaning, death, and truth, soon finds themselves alienated because the crowd is incapable of hearing such truths without recoiling. This alienation is not a personal failure, but a structural reality of human psychology. Most people cannot bear to lift the mask of society. Thus, those who do, those who see through illusion, are condemned to walk alone. Nietzsche sharpened this insight even further. For him, the individual who separates from the herd is not merely a recluse, but a creator. He described the higher type of person, the one who dares to stand apart, as someone who embraces solitude as the crucible where new values are forged. He who has a why to live, Nietzsche declared, can bear almost any how. But finding that why requires withdrawing from the shallow scripts of society and facing the abyss of existence directly. This is why Nietzsche spoke of solitude with both dread and reverence. It is the terrifying arena where the self either collapses into despair or transcends into creation. Solitude, then, is not just isolation, it is initiation. Yet modern culture makes this initiation almost impossible. Our society has weaponized distraction to a degree Schopenhauer could never have imagined. The constant hum of smartphones, social media, and entertainment ensures that the average person rarely spends more than a few minutes in true solitude. The result is a generation addicted to noise, not because the noise is meaningful, but because silence feels unbearable. Studies show that many people would rather administer mild electric shocks to themselves than sit alone in a room with their thoughts. This startling fact reveals the psychological depth of the problem. Solitude forces us into confrontation with the self, and for most, the self is a stranger too frightening to face. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, once observed that the modern person suffers not from hunger or poverty as much as from an existential vacuum. This vacuum is the emptiness that appears when external distractions are stripped away. It is the moment in solitude when you realize your life is not driven by your own chosen meaning, but by borrowed desires from others. Society keeps this vacuum hidden under layers of busyness and chatter, but solitude tears away the veil. The great minds Schopenhauer admired, philosophers, artists, sages, did not fear this vacuum. They plunged into it, wrestled with it, and from it carved meaning. For the rest of us, the vacuum is unbearable, so we keep filling it with noise. And yet, here lies the cruel irony. The very thing we fear in solitude, the silence, the emptiness, the confrontation with truth, is also the only path to authenticity. To remain in the crowd is to live borrowed lives, chasing borrowed desires, trapped in endless cycles of comparison. But to walk alone is to risk exposure to the abyss, to risk despair, and perhaps even madness. The choice is not between comfort and discomfort, it is between illusion and truth. The crowd gives us comfort at the price of deception. Solitude gives us truth at the price of suffering. Which is worse, to live comfortably asleep or painfully awake? Schopenhauer insisted that most will choose sleep. Society, after all, is designed to reward conformity and punish deviation. The individual who withdraws risks being labeled antisocial, arrogant, or broken. But is it not stranger still to imagine that truth could ever be found in a crowd? A crowd does not think, it reacts. A crowd does not seek truth, it seeks belonging. And so the wisest minds, the ones unwilling to sacrifice truth for comfort, retreat. They may appear aloof or cold, but in truth they are fighting a battle that society refuses to even recognize, the battle against illusion. This recognition reshapes our understanding of solitude. It is not merely absence of company, it is a rebellion against the forces that keep us asleep. It is the confrontation with the raw machinery of desire and illusion. It is the crucible where one either breaks under the weight of existence or awakens into clarity. To fear solitude, then, is to fear the very condition that makes wisdom possible. And so, the hidden problem emerges. It is not that solitude is unbearable, but that society has conditioned us to believe we cannot survive without its noise. We are trained from birth to equate silence with emptiness, and emptiness with failure. But Schopenhauer turns this upside down. He suggests that only in emptiness do we touch reality, and only in silence do we hear the truth. The problem is not solitude. The problem is that we have been taught to fear it. The unseen consequences. If solitude is the path to authenticity, then the avoidance of solitude must come at a cost, and indeed the cost is immense, though it often remains invisible until it is too late. What happens when entire generations are conditioned to fear silence, to recoil from solitude, to seek refuge only in the constant hum of society? The answer is both psychological and cultural. We become strangers to ourselves. We trade the depth of inner life for the surface glitter of approval. We drown our hunger for meaning in endless noise, and then we wonder why we feel hollow. These are the unseen consequences of fleeing from solitude, and they seep into every corner of human life. On the personal level, the refusal to engage with solitude breeds an endless restlessness. Notice how quickly boredom sets in when the phone dies, when the conversation lulls, when the television goes silent. This restlessness is not a trivial quirk. It is a symptom of inner emptiness. Psychologists describe it as a form of experiential avoidance, the desperate attempt to escape uncomfortable thoughts and feelings by filling every moment with distraction. But the more we avoid, the more powerful the avoided truths become. The shadow grows larger in the background. Carl J. Jung warned that what we fail to integrate returns to us in destructive forms. Thus, when solitude is avoided, suppressed truths resurface as anxiety, depression, or compulsive behaviors. The irony is painful. In fleeing solitude to avoid discomfort, we create lives riddled with far greater suffering. Consider the epidemic of loneliness in modern societies. Paradoxically, we are more connected than ever before, digitally linked, socially networked, endlessly communicating, yet people report higher levels of loneliness than in any previous generation. Why? Because our connections have become shallow, and our fear of solitude drives us to quantity over quality. We collect acquaintances instead of friendships, likes instead of love, validation instead of understanding. We mistake the buzz of activity for the warmth of belonging, and in doing so, we deepen the void within. Loneliness is not solved by the presence of others, but by the ability to live authentically with oneself, and that ability can only be forged in solitude. Thus, the more we fear solitude, the lonelier we become, even in crowds. The consequences ripple outward into society. When individuals cannot bear to face themselves, they become easy prey for manipulation. Advertisers, political movements, influencers, and corporations thrive on our terror of being alone. They offer us endless distractions, endless identities to adopt, endless promises of belonging, and because we fear silence, we grasp at these illusions. We buy products to fill the void, join movements to escape our insignificance, immerse ourselves in entertainment to avoid our thoughts. The marketplace of society is built on this very fear. The fear of solitude ensures endless consumption. Schopenhauer would say, we are like thirsty wanderers drinking salt water. The more we drink, the thirstier we become. And yet we keep drinking because the alternative is to face the desert of silence. Cognitive science supports this view. Studies on the brain's default mode network reveal that in moments of rest, when external stimulation is absent, the mind turns inward, reflecting, integrating memories, confronting unresolved conflicts. This is precisely why solitude is so difficult. It activates the parts of the mind we least wish to face. But if we never endure this inner confrontation, our identities remain fragile and fragmented. We live borrowed scripts instead of crafting our own. This fragility explains why modern society is filled with people who are easily offended, easily manipulated, and perpetually insecure. When the self has not been forged in solitude, it depends entirely on external validation. And anything that threatens that validation feels like annihilation. Jean-Paul Sartre captured this predicament in his haunting phrase, "Hell is other people." Misunderstood as misanthropy, the statement in fact points to a deeper reality. When we cannot endure solitude, we become enslaved to how others see us. We live in the gaze of the other, trapped in a hall of mirrors where our identity is nothing more than a reflection of others' expectations. This is hell, not because people are inherently cruel, but because dependence on their perception robs us of authenticity. The unseen consequence of fleeing solitude is that we hand over our very selves to the crowd. We live not as who we are, but as who society demands we be. The cultural cost is equally devastating. Societies that fear solitude become incapable of producing true originality. Innovation, art, philosophy. These are born not from crowds, but from individuals who dared to step away. The crowd produces conformity. Solitude produces creation. History shows us this again and again. The revolutionary breakthroughs of thought, from Socrates to Nietzsche, from Beethoven to Kafka, arose not in the bustle of social chatter, but in the crucible of solitude. When solitude is feared, culture stagnates. We end up with endless repetition of shallow forms, recycled ideas, entertainment instead of art. We create societies that excel at distraction but starve for meaning. Even spirituality is corrupted by this fear. Where once spiritual traditions emphasized retreat, contemplation, and silence as pathways to the divine, modern culture transforms spirituality into yet another form of social performance. Meditation apps, inspirational slogans, spiritual influences. These are designed less to foster solitude than to provide the appearance of it while keeping us tethered to the crowd. True solitude, the kind that confronts the abyss, is replaced with curated pseudo-solitude, safe, marketable, and empty. Thus, the very practices meant to liberate us are repackaged into distractions. The consequence is a spirituality that soothes but never transforms. But perhaps the most tragic consequence is existential. When solitude is avoided, death itself becomes unbearable. Schopenhauer insisted that death is the ultimate solitude, the final separation of the self from all society. If we spend our lives avoiding solitude, then when death comes, we face it as absolute terror. We are unprepared, strangers to the silence that greets us. But those who have practiced solitude, who have walked willingly into silence in life, meet death with a different gaze. They recognize it not as an alien horror, but as the continuation of the solitude they have already embraced. To fear solitude is ultimately to fear death. To embrace solitude is to reconcile with mortality. This may be the deepest consequence of all. The unseen consequences of our avoidance, then, are everywhere. On the personal level, we suffer anxiety, emptiness, and loneliness. On the societal level, we are manipulated, fragmented, and stagnant. On the spiritual level, we turn transformation into performance. And on the existential level, we face death with terror instead of clarity. Schopenhauer unmasks this brutal truth. By clinging to the crowd, we do not escape suffering. We only trade one form of suffering for another, less honest one. We trade the sharp sting of solitude for the dull ache of illusion. And in doing so, we lose ourselves, which leaves us with a haunting realization. Perhaps the true madness is not in solitude, but in society itself. Perhaps what we call normal life is a carefully constructed insanity, sustained only because so many participate in it together. If this is true, then the solitary figure, mocked as eccentric, dismissed as antisocial, may in fact be the only sane one among us. But how then can we follow that path? If solitude is so terrifying, how can one learn to endure it without collapsing into despair? This question sets the stage for the rebellion, the radical possibility of breaking free. The rebellion. How to break free. Imagine again that silent room where you sit alone, stripped of every distraction, no voices to assure you, no screens to numb the restlessness, no tasks to disguise the void. At first, the silence feels unbearable. Your mind claws for noise, for validation, for the familiar hum of the world. But then, something strange happens. If you do not run, if you refuse to flee, the silence changes. It begins to feel less like emptiness and more like clarity, as though the fog of illusion is lifting. You begin to notice thoughts that have long been buried, questions that society taught you never to ask, truths that no crowd could ever reveal. This is the beginning of the rebellion, learning to endure solitude, not as punishment, but as liberation. Breaking free begins with a shift in perception. Most people view solitude as the absence of something valuable, a deficiency, a failure to belong. But what if solitude is not absence at all, but presence? The presence of the self, of reality, of truth, stripped of distraction. Schopenhauer taught that the crowd enslaves us to appearances. To rebel is to turn your gaze away from appearances and toward essence. This requires courage, because the first thing you encounter in solitude is discomfort. Nietzsche called this discomfort the wilderness. He wrote of the solitary individual as a wanderer, leaving behind the comfort of the herd to cross a barren desert. In that desert, one feels lost, exposed, even broken. But Nietzsche insisted that only in the wilderness can one become a creator. Solitude is not a void but a forge, and the rebellion is to endure the fire until something new is born within you. How then can one cultivate this rebellion in a world designed to prevent it? The first step is to practice intentional silence. This means deliberately setting aside time where no external noise is allowed, no phone, no conversation, no television. At first, this will feel unbearable, like withdrawal from an addiction. But with persistence, the silence begins to reveal its hidden depths. You start to hear the quieter voices of your own mind, the ones drowned out by constant noise. These voices carry truths you have ignored. Your real desires, your hidden fears, your unasked questions. To rebel is to let these voices speak, no matter how unsettling. The second step is to reframe loneliness. Society equates being alone with being unloved, unwanted, or incomplete. But solitude is not loneliness. It is the ability to exist fully without depending on the gaze of others. To embrace solitude is to reclaim sovereignty over your own existence. Viktor Frankl discovered in the camps of Auschwitz that even when everything is stripped away, possessions, status, family, even freedom, one thing remains: the ability to choose one's own attitude toward existence. This choice is only possible when one ceases to depend entirely on external validation. Solitude, then, is not deprivation but empowerment. It is the training ground where you discover that your worth is not borrowed from society but arises from within. The third step of rebellion is to confront the abyss directly. Every philosophy, every religion, every psychological theory ultimately grapples with the same terrifying truth. Existence is fragile, fleeting, and filled with suffering. Society teaches us to avoid this truth through distraction, chasing pleasure, status, or belonging, but solitude forces us to confront it head-on. Schopenhauer argued that wisdom begins with the recognition of suffering, because only then can we stop living in denial. To sit in solitude is to feel the weight of mortality, the inevitability of loss, the futility of endless desire. This confrontation is not meant to destroy you, but to awaken you. The rebellion is to stop running and to look suffering in the face, to say, yes, life is pain, but it is mine to endure, and in enduring it consciously, I rise above it. History offers countless examples of this rebellion. Consider Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who, despite ruling one of the largest empires in history, turned inward to write his meditations, private reflections on mortality, duty, and truth. Surrounded by politics and noise, he sought solitude to preserve his sanity. Or consider Emily Dickinson, who lived most of her life in near total seclusion, yet produced poetry of staggering depth, piercing truths that the social chatter of her age could never have contained. Or Kafka, who, isolated in his restless solitude, gave voice to the alienation of the modern world. Each of these figures illustrates the same pattern. By turning away from society, they tapped into truths that society itself could never reveal. But rebellion does not mean abandoning humanity entirely. Schopenhauer himself acknowledged that while solitude is essential, occasional contact with others prevents despair. The difference is in proportion. Solitude must be the foundation, society only a supplement. Most people invert this, drowning themselves in endless social noise and sprinkling in solitude as a rare luxury. The rebellion is to reverse this. Balance, to build life on solitude and use society only as needed, never as a crutch. This inversion transforms existence. You no longer seek approval because you have already faced yourself. You no longer fear rejection because solitude is no longer terrifying. You no longer confuse noise with meaning because you know meaning is born in silence. This shift is radical because it undermines the very structure of society. A person who no longer fears solitude cannot be manipulated by the promise of belonging. They cannot be coerced by threats of exclusion. They no longer need to conform to empty trends or chase superficial validation. In short, they become free. Schopenhauer would say they rise above the blind will that enslaves the masses. Nietzsche would call them creators of new values. Frankl would describe them as discovering meaning in the face of suffering. Whatever the language, the essence is the same. Rebellion is freedom through solitude. Yet freedom always comes with a price. To embrace solitude is to walk a path that others will not understand. You may be ridiculed, labeled as aloof or antisocial, even pitied. The crowd distrusts those who refuse to need it. But what is their scorn compared to the weight of living a borrowed life? Better to walk alone in truth than to be embraced by a crowd in illusion. The rebellion demands courage, but the reward is authenticity. So here we stand at the threshold. The path of solitude stretches before you, silent, uncertain, perhaps terrifying. The path of society lies behind you, noisy, comforting, but filled with illusion. To choose solitude is to rebel not only against society, but against your own conditioned fears. It is to step into a wilderness where meaning is no longer given but must be forged. But for those who endure, the wilderness is not a wasteland. It is the birthplace of truth. And yet, even now, a question stirs. If solitude is liberation, if rebellion is possible, what lies beyond it? What ultimate truth emerges when the silence has been endured long enough, when the rebellion has burned away every illusion. This leads us to the final revelation, the ultimate truth that redefines everything we thought we knew about life, death, and meaning itself. And yet when we come to the fifth unfolding of this theme, we must grasp with complete seriousness that Schopenhauer's steady insistence on solitude was not some decorative flourish to make his philosophy appear more ascetic or more unique, but rather the logical culmination of his understanding of human will and human suffering. For he was convinced that the crowd not only distracts, but also perpetually feeds the restless striving of the will, that ceaseless hunger which can never be satisfied, and in his eyes the one who seeks truth must flee from those environments that only deepen illusions. For society thrives on mutual flattery, vanity, gossip, the endless exchange of petty judgments, and above all on the pressure to conform to what is comfortable rather than what is true. So the thinker who chooses solitude is not merely antisocial, but is, in a sense, rebelling against the machinery of delusion that makes human beings slaves to one another's shallow approval. And it is here, at this fifth step, that we see the final layers of his thought begin to peel away illusions, until only the bare and cold clarity of his philosophy remains, showing us that to be truly wise is to recognize that most friendships are transactional, most conversations shallow, and most gatherings filled with a subtle hostility disguised as courtesy, where every individual seeks to outshine, to be admired, to win some invisible contest of self-importance, and so solitude becomes the only environment in which one can protect the integrity of one's mind from erosion by the tides of mediocrity. The striking thing about Schopenhauer is that he does not soften this judgment. He does not, like many other philosophers, offer some gentle compromise that admits of certain friendships or certain noble companions. For even when he grants that friendship exists, it is, in his eyes, fragile and rare, like a flickering candle in the storm, easily extinguished by betrayal, misunderstanding, or the simple passage of time, and he insists that anyone who pins their happiness on social life will inevitably be disappointed because society is governed by envy, competition, and the self-interest of each member, whereas solitude, though it may appear barren and cold, is the soil in which genuine independence and therefore genuine wisdom can grow. Consider the metaphor he often hinted at: the wise man as a solitary mountain peak, rising above the plains of everyday existence, bathed in silence and exposed to storms, yet seeing further than the dwellers below, and one senses here the sharp edge of his pessimism, for he does not imagine that everyone can or should live this way, but he does suggest that the rare few who carry within them the heavy burden of thought, those who feel the insufficiency of social amusements and the emptiness of endless chatter, must embrace solitude not as a punishment, but as their rightful condition, almost as if they were born not to belong, but to observe, not to be soothed, but to see. In this fifth expansion, we can see that Schopenhauer's philosophy of solitude is inseparable from his theory of suffering, because he believed that most human company amplifies suffering rather than reduces it, for the presence of others brings with it comparison, jealousy, rivalry, and endless small irritations, whereas solitude, though it confronts us with ourselves, liberates us from the thousand petty wounds inflicted by daily interaction. Thus, solitude becomes a lesser suffering that protects us from greater suffering, and, in the arithmetic of life, this trade-off is the only rational one for the wise. To many this seems bleak, but if we follow his reasoning carefully, we discover that his embrace of solitude is not a rejection of humanity, but an attempt to salvage something of dignity and peace from a world that otherwise enslaves us to its restless will. For in solitude, the mind may finally turn to art, to philosophy, to the contemplation of the sublime, and even, paradoxically, to compassion, since he argued that only those who withdraw from the frenzy of self-interest can truly perceive the suffering of others without selfish distortion, so that solitude becomes the gateway not to misanthropy, but to a purer form of empathy, one uncorrupted by the competition and hypocrisy of social life. This is the paradox at the heart of Schopenhauer's teaching, that by stepping away from people we can see more clearly what binds us to them, that by denying ourselves the shallow comforts of society we may cultivate the deeper recognition that all are united by suffering, and so solitude becomes a mirror in which both the futility of individual striving and the universality of pain are revealed, a truth unbearable for most but indispensable for the few who seek wisdom. And if we press further, we find that for him, solitude was not merely practical but metaphysical. For in solitude one glimpses the reality that the individual is but a manifestation of the blind will, and in stepping away from society, one resists the constant reminders to indulge, to consume, to compete, thus carving out a fragile space in which the will can be quieted, however briefly, and perhaps this is why he saw the lives of saints, ascetics, and monks with such ambivalent admiration, because they represented in extreme form the same principle he advocated for the philosopher: the refusal to allow the world's noise to drown out the faint but crucial possibility of inner stillness. In this way, the fifth section of our unfolding reveals that the wise do not choose solitude because they despise humanity, though they may be disappointed by it, but because they recognize that only in silence, only in retreat, does the possibility of truth remain uncorrupted, and that the price of wisdom is often loneliness, though it is a loneliness infused with clarity, the kind that allows one to look upon life without illusion, to endure suffering without self-deception, and perhaps even to transcend, for brief moments, the restless will that binds all creatures to their endless striving. Thus, in Schopenhauer's Unmasking of Society, solitude is no mere preference but destiny for the higher mind, and to resist it is to betray one's own nature, to seek refuge in illusions that can never satisfy, whereas to embrace it is to stand alone but unshaken, exposed but free, wounded but awake. And this, he tells us without hesitation, is the final truth of the philosopher's path, that solitude is not exile but elevation, not deprivation but liberation, and though it may seem to the many like suffering, to the few it is the only life worth living.